When I opened my garage door that Thursday morning, the last thing I expected to see was someone else's boot prints in the dust and my tool chest cracked open. My name's Yarden Price, and I've lived in the Maplewood Pines neighborhood for 13 years. It's your typical suburban cul-de-sac, decent neighbors, trimmed hedges, and an HOA that thinks it's a branch of government. I dealt with their passive-aggressive letters and nitpicky fines before, but this time, they went too far. I leaned into the garage, scanning everything. My shelves were rearranged. My riding mower had been moved. I walked over to it, frowning. The key was missing from the ignition. I always leave it there since the garage is locked and alarmed. That's when I noticed the side door. The deadbolt was hanging by a single screw. That door had been locked since I moved in. I stood there, heart thumping in my chest like a war drum, staring at the obvious signs of forced entry. And not forced like a burglar kicking it in. No, this was precise. Clean. Someone had picked the lock or used a key. I reached for my phone and called the one neighbor I trusted, Marcus from across the street. He's ex-Air Force, owns a security company now. I asked if his porch cams caught anything last night. Yup, he said. You're gonna want to come see this. I jogged across the street, stepping over the pile of mulch he always left in his driveway. Marcus had already pulled up the footage. The timestamp read 3:43 a.m. There she was, Harlow Zimmerman, president of the Maplewood Pines HOA. 50-something, always wore pastel cardigans and had that fake sweet voice that made your teeth hurt. She was walking up my driveway with a flashlight followed by two other board members, her lapdogs, Kent and Sheila. All three had gloves on. One of them had a crowbar. I watched, dumbfounded, as they pried open my side door and slipped inside. They were in there for 10 minutes, Marcus said, tapping the screen. Look, see? They moved stuff around. Looks like they were searching for something. My jaw clenched. Did you call the cops? I figured you'd want to do that. I did. And when Officer Delgado showed up, she took one look at the footage and let out a low whistle. They broke and entered. That's criminal trespass, she said, scribbling in her notepad. You want to press charges? Absolutely, I said. She nodded. You'll need to file a formal report. I'll get copies of the footage. You might also want to talk to an attorney. That's when I knew this wasn't just some weird misunderstanding. This was targeted. Later that afternoon, as I was boarding up the broken door, a white Lexus pulled up in front of my house. Out stepped Harlow, clipboard in hand like she was about to do a bake sale, not like she'd just been caught red-handed breaking into my property. Yarden, she called, her voice sugary but tight. Can we have a word? I dropped the hammer I was holding and walked toward her, wiping sweat off my brow. You've got 10 seconds, I said, glaring. She smiled like I was a child who didn't know what was good for me. We received a report that you were storing prohibited equipment in your garage. Gas-powered tools. Against HOA regulations. I blinked. That's not true. And even if it was, that doesn't give you the right to break in. We had probable cause, she said, crossing her arms. The HOA bylaws allow inspections if there's reason to believe. You're not law enforcement, I snapped. You can't just break into someone's garage. She tilted her head. You'll find the HOA has more authority than you think. Then we'll let the courts decide. Her smile dropped. I turned and walked back inside, slamming the door behind me. That night, I called my cousin, who happens to be a real estate attorney. She agreed to meet the next morning and help me file a civil suit for trespassing, property damage, and invasion of privacy. By Friday afternoon, I had the paperwork ready to go. I also made a few copies of the security footage and started talking to my neighbors. Turns out, I wasn't the only one they targeted. Doug, 3 houses down, said they threatened to fine him $500 for a non-regulation mailbox. Lisa, 2 blocks over, said they entered her backyard while she was at work and took pictures of her patio furniture. People were fed up, so I printed flyers. Bold letters at the top. HOA trespasses into homes, you could be next. By sunset, every mailbox had one. Harlow must have seen them by Saturday morning, because she came storming down the sidewalk like a hurricane in pearls. She pounded on my door and shouted, "This is defamation." I opened the door just enough to look her in the eye. "No," I said calmly. "It's the truth." She jabbed a finger at me. "You're making a mistake. The board won't stand for this. You should have thought of that before you broke into my garage." She turned on her heel and marched off, fuming. That night, I installed 2 more cameras around my property. Motion lights, too. I wasn't taking any chances. By Monday, I had a court date. And not only were they being sued, but the police were actively investigating the break-in. Officer Delgado had already called me twice to confirm statements and ask follow-ups. But Harlow? She doubled down. The HOA sent me a fine, $2,000, for non-compliance with lawn maintenance standards. I hadn't mowed in 4 days. It was retaliation, plain and simple. I took the fine and tacked it to the community bulletin board, right next to a copy of the trespassing police report. By Tuesday, 10 more neighbors had come forward with stories. The so-called inspections, the bogus fines, the intimidation. And suddenly, the neighborhood wasn't on her side anymore. It was on mine. By Wednesday morning, the tension in Maplewood Pines had reached a quiet boiling point. I woke up to find a folded envelope wedged between my front door and the frame, not mailed, not taped, just jammed in like a warning. Inside was a formal notice of intent to initiate lien, signed by Kent Dobbins, the HOA's treasurer. According to them, I had deliberately incited unrest and damaged the standing of the HOA, which they claimed violated some obscure clause buried deep in the bylaws. They were threatening to put a lien on my house for the unpaid fine plus legal fees. But here's the thing. My cousin, the attorney, had already pored over the HOA's governing documents and state law. And what the HOA was trying to do, completely unenforceable. They were bluffing. Worse, they were digging themselves deeper. I drove straight to the county clerk's office. The woman behind the desk, a sharp-eyed clerk named Felicia, took one look at the paperwork and laughed under her breath. They filed this through an internal form, she said, flipping pages. This isn't even a legally registered lien. It's like threatening eviction with a library card. I asked her to make official copies and certify the timestamp. That would come in handy later. That afternoon, Marcus helped me set up a private meeting with a few neighbors in his backyard. He'd pulled out his old projector and hooked it up to his laptop, looping the footage of Harlow and her stooges breaking into my garage onto a white sheet he'd nailed to the fence. The mood was focused. No one was cracking jokes or whispering. People were angry, but controlled. I stood in front of the group and laid out everything. The forced entry, the bogus fines, the illegal lien notice. One by one, others added their own experiences. That's when we discovered something chilling. Sheila, the HOA's secretary, had been accessing residents' gate codes. Lisa, who worked night shifts at the hospital, mentioned she'd seen Sheila in the HOA office with a printed spreadsheet labeled Access Directory. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it clicked. That's how they got into my garage. They didn't pick anything. They had my code. Doug, who used to work for a private security firm, stepped forward. If they're using access codes without consent, he said, that's unauthorized system access. That's a felony under state law. I filed a police report the next morning. This time, Delgado brought someone with her, a man in plain clothes who introduced himself as Detective Monroe. He listened carefully, never interrupting, and then asked for copies of the security footage, the gate code spreadsheet. Lisa had snapped a blurry photo of it on her phone in the fake lien letter. When I handed it all over, I caught the first flicker of real concern in his expression. This is more than civil trespass, he said. If they're using private codes without permission, they could be looking at criminal conspiracy, unlawful access to a protected system, and possible misuse of privileged information. I didn't say anything. I just nodded slightly. The detective thanked me and left, quietly but deliberately. That evening, I noticed something new. The HOA bulletin board near the clubhouse had been stripped bare. Every flyer, announcement, and complaint was gone. In its place was a single laminated message. Unauthorized postings are subject to immediate removal. Residents are reminded to direct all concerns through official HOA channels. But the residents weren't playing their game anymore. By the weekend, word had spread that the HOA's actions were under criminal investigation. Kent and Sheila stopped showing up to the clubhouse. Harlow, however, doubled down. She began walking the neighborhood with a clipboard again, this time accompanied by a man none of us recognized, bald, stocky, wearing a tight polo with Property Compliance Services embroidered on the chest. He wasn't a resident, and no one had voted on new contractors. I confronted them near the end of my block. "Who's this?" I asked, stepping onto the sidewalk in front of them. Harlow didn't answer. The man gave me a quick once-over. "We're conducting a compliance sweep," he said flatly. "This is private property," I replied. "You're not authorized to be here without resident approval." Harlow cleared her throat. The board has full authority to contract third-party evaluators. Not without a vote. And not during an active investigation. The man smirked an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. If you interfere, I'll have to file an obstruction report. Go ahead, I said. And make sure to spell my name right when the judge asks why you were trespassing. They left the block within minutes. On Monday, I got a call from Detective Monroe. We're moving forward with charges, he said. We've already subpoenaed HOA communications and digital records. You might want to prepare for a court appearance. I asked him what kind of charges they were looking at. For now, unlawful entry, unauthorized access to secured systems, and filing fraudulent financial documents. But if we find evidence of collusion or misuse of funds, it could escalate. I thanked him and hung up. That night, I updated the neighbors in a quiet gathering behind Marcus's fence. No big speeches this time. Just facts. And a plan. We drafted a petition to hold an emergency vote for HOA board dissolution. According to the bylaws, if 35% of homeowners signed, we could force a vote to remove sitting board members. We had over 50 signatures by the end of the night. By Thursday, Harlow hit back again. Every resident who had signed the petition found a compliance warning taped to their door. Each letter highlighted a different violation: overgrown shrubs, improper trash bin placement, unapproved paint colors. Petty, obvious retaliation. But it backfired spectacularly. Marcus installed a live feed camera on his roof and streamed it to a private neighborhood server. We caught Sheila Hand delivering the warnings in the middle of the night wearing gloves again and carrying a flashlight. We submitted the footage to the detective. The final nail came Friday morning. Felicia, the clerk, called me. She'd found something. Apparently, the HOA had filed an internal motion 2 years ago to triple board member stipends. It wasn't disclosed in any minutes, and it wasn't approved by residents. Over $15,000 had been funneled through administrative disbursements to Harlow, Kent, and Sheila. That crossed the line from misconduct into embezzlement. I sent the discovery straight to Monroe. He didn't say much. Just thank you. That changes things. The next day, a squad car parked outside Harlow's house. 2 officers knocked. She tried to shut the door on them, but they stepped inside before it closed. She was escorted out 10 minutes later, still in her cardigan, hair frizzed from shouting. The neighborhood was quiet that afternoon. Kent and Sheila were picked up later that evening. No drama, no press, just quiet justice. At the emergency vote 2 weeks later, the board was dissolved. We voted in a new one, smaller, transparent, and tied to a rotating oversight committee made up of residents. I declined to run. I'd had enough of HOA politics for a lifetime. But I did volunteer to head the petition committee that would make sure nothing like this ever happened again. Maplewood Pines had its peace back. And as for my garage, I repainted the door, replaced the lock, and installed a reinforced steel deadbolt with biometric access. Just for good measure. The neighborhood felt different in the weeks that followed the board's collapse. Not just quieter, but clearer, like someone had finally shut off the background static that had been humming for years. The clubhouse sat locked and silent. The printed signs that once sparked rules about trash bins and lawn lengths had been torn down or weathered into unreadable scraps. For the first time in a long while, Maplewood Pines felt like it belonged to its residents again. But the silence didn't last. 3 weeks after Harlow was arrested, I got a call from Detective Monroe. I had just stepped out of my truck with 2 bags of mulch slung over one shoulder when my phone buzzed. "I need you to come into the station," he said. We pulled data off Sheila's laptop. "There's something you need to see." I didn't ask questions. I just drove. Monroe was waiting for me in a small room behind the main desk, a manila folder already open in front of him. He didn't waste time. "Sheila kept detailed records," he said, sliding a sheet of paper toward me. Too detailed. The printout was a spreadsheet, columns of names, addresses, and in the far right column, codes. Some were labeled gate, others garage, some just said access. My name was halfway down the list. Next to it, a series of digits and the label emergency override. I stared at it for a long time before speaking. They had master access codes? Monroe nodded. They obtained them through a backdoor in the vendor software. HOA management software contracts often include admin tools for emergency system resets, override codes, things that are supposed to be tightly controlled. But someone on the board had root-level access and used it to generate entry codes for individual properties. That's how they got into my garage. And likely several others, Monroe said. But that's not the worst of it. He tapped the folder again, then pulled out a printed email chain. The subject line read, Q3 Collection Strategy. These are internal emails between the board members. They were targeting properties with high equity and low mortgage balances. Homeowners like you people who were less likely to have liens on record. They'd issue fabricated fines, then start lien proceedings when residents didn't pay. They were trying to force sales. Exactly. We're working with the DA's office now. This is organized fraud. Possibly racketeering. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process it all. Any idea how far it goes? We're still digging. But from what we've found, they had deals lined up with a shell company, Cypress Ridge Holdings. It's registered out of state, but Harlow's name shows up on some of the incorporation paperwork under a pseudonym. A knock at the door interrupted us. Another officer entered and handed Monroe a flash drive and a printed transcript. He skimmed it, then handed it to me. This is from a recorded call between Kent and their attorney. He was trying to convince the lawyer to clean up the paper trail in exchange for a cut of future proceeds. I blinked. You mean they were planning to keep doing this? Until someone stopped them. The DA's office filed formal charges that week. 37 counts, including wire fraud, criminal trespass, unlawful surveillance, and conspiracy to commit property theft. The story made local news. By the following Monday, reporters were circling Maplewood Pines like vultures. A few tried to knock on my door. I ignored them, but not everyone stayed quiet. At the town hall meeting the city council held in response to the scandal, residents from other neighborhoods began to speak up. Turns out, Maplewood Pines wasn't an isolated case. An older woman named June, from a community called Silver Hollow, stood up and described how her HOA had fined her $600 for unauthorized fencing. When she refused to pay, they placed a lien and tried to push her into foreclosure. Another man, a former postal worker, talked about how his HOA accidentally recorded his conversations through a community security system, then used the transcripts to fabricate behavioral violations. It wasn't just Maplewood Pines. It was systemic. The council voted to launch a task force to investigate HOA abuse across the county, and I was asked to serve as one of the civilian consultants. I didn't want to. Not at first. I'd already lost sleep, time, and trust. But then I thought about the access codes, the forged fines, the way they'd crept into people's lives like termites behind the drywall. Quiet, hidden, destructive. I agreed. The task force met twice a week in the old courthouse annex. I sat beside lawyers, auditors, and 2 other homeowners who'd gone through similar nightmares. One of them, a retired Marine named Carlos, had fought his HOA after they tried to ban American flags. He now ran a legal aid group for veterans facing housing disputes. Carlos and I hit it off quickly. He was blunt, detail-oriented, and had a habit of outlining cases in color-coded folders that he carried in a duffel bag. He gave me a crash course in HOA reform law and loan fraud patterns. You see this pattern? He said one afternoon, pointing to a document. This is how they push homeowners into panic. Fine. Threat. Lien. Settlement offer. Lowball buyout. Repeat. They treat neighborhoods like revenue farms. Exactly. And most people don't fight back. You did. The DA's office called me to testify 2 months later. The trial was scheduled for early fall. Harlow had pleaded not guilty. Her lawyer, a sharp-jawed man in a blue pinstripe suit, tried to argue that the board had acted out of desperate necessity to maintain property values. I took the stand and laid out the facts. The footage, the code spreadsheets, the emails, the override lists, the retaliatory fines, the shell company. Every piece of the story came out under oath, each detail another weight crashing down on their defense like bricks on cracked concrete. When they played the garage footage on the courtroom projector, no one made a sound. The jury took less than 5 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. On 32 counts. Harlow was sentenced to 7 years in prison, with no chance of parole for at least 4. Kent and Sheila each received 5. The judge called their actions a calculated betrayal of public trust. After the sentencing, the DA shook my hand outside the courthouse. You didn't just stop them, she said. You exposed the whole model. I nodded, but I didn't feel triumphant. Just steady, like a storm had passed, and the wreckage was visible in full daylight. Back in Maplewood Pines, residents had begun to rebuild not just their yards, but their trust. The new board operated with full transparency. Every budget line was posted publicly. Every vote was open. No more closed-door decisions. No more mystery fines. Marcus helped install a new access system that no one, not even the board, could override without homeowner consent. The neighborhood pooled funds to hire a third-party auditing firm to monitor spending quarterly. And the clubhouse? It was reopened as a community center with potlucks, movie nights, and free legal clinics. The last time I walked past it, a group of kids were drawing chalk art on the sidewalk. One of them had written in big block letters, "Our neighborhood, our rules." Carlos sent me a thank you card a few weeks later. Inside was a small patch embroidered with the words, "Watchdog Division." He'd made it up just for laughs. I pinned it to the inside of my garage door. I kept that space empty for a while. No mower, no tool chest, not even a bike. But recently, I'd started moving things back in. Not because I forgot what happened, but because I'd reclaimed it. Not just the garage, the whole damn neighborhood. It had been 5 months since the trial ended and the verdicts were read. The courtroom had emptied, the cameras had turned away, and the neighborhood had begun to stitch itself back together, not with grand gestures, but in the quiet moments. Neighbors helping each other repaint fences, kids biking freely without dodging clipboard patrols, spontaneous driveway barbecues that lasted too late and too loud. Maplewood Pines had learned something vital: freedom doesn't come from silence, but participation. But just when we thought the worst was over, another layer peeled back. It started with a letter not to me, but to the county prosecutor's office. A former contractor who had done minor landscaping work for the HOA came forward. His signed affidavit triggered a follow-up investigation and, eventually, a full-blown audit. According to his statement, he'd been paid cash for work that never happened, payments he was told to accept under the table and then return as a donation to the HOA's discretionary fund. That fund didn't exist in the official budget. Detective Monroe called me again, his voice lower than usual. "You might want to sit down." I stayed standing. "We found a second set of books," he said. Encrypted spreadsheets on Kent's personal laptop. They tracked what they called off-ledger reserves. That's where the contractor payments went. We're talking about tens of thousands siphoned over 4 years. I asked him how they'd been able to hide it from the public audits. Monroe paused. They used a dual system. The public books were sanitized. The real ones listed fake vendors, ghost maintenance jobs, and inflated reimbursements. And there's more. I already felt the ground shifting under me. There's a document labeled Priority Transfers. It's a list of residents flagged for future financial action. Most were elderly or lived alone. A few had medical debt. Every name had a projected equity estimate next to it, plus notes evaluating the likelihood of resistance. I said nothing. They were grooming homes, Monroe continued, waiting for the right moment to pounce. The DA's office unsealed the new charges the following week. They added financial elder abuse, systematic fraud, falsification of public records, and conspiracy to commit real estate theft. The evidence was categorized into 4 volumes of discovery. The courtroom this time was larger. Federal prosecutors had taken over. Harlow, Kent, and Sheila were transferred to a county facility with tighter security. Their defense attorneys tried to stall, arguing for an extended discovery period, but the judge denied it. I wasn't called to testify again, not this round. My role had been played and recorded. But I attended every day, sitting in the second row behind the railing, watching the prosecution dismantle every excuse the defense tried to mount. One witness, a retired postal dispatcher named Franklin Glasser, testified how Kent had offered to help him catch up on dues if he signed a pre-filled settlement agreement. Franklin couldn't read well anymore. His eyesight had faded after his stroke. He signed it, trusting them. The document turned out to be a transfer of title. The room was silent when he said, "They took my house while I was trying to pay them." The jury looked rattled. The judge looked furious. Over 12 days, the prosecution laid out the entire scheme: the forged notices, the override codes, the shell companies, the hidden accounts. The final blow was a recorded call between Sheila and a title agent in which she laughed about finally flipping the Glasser property and mentioned her cut would be worth the paperwork. It wasn't a trial anymore, it was a reckoning. The defense tried one last tactic. They argued that the HOA was under immense pressure to prevent property devaluation in the wake of the 2008 housing crash, that their strategies were aggressive, not malicious. But that argument collapsed under its own weight when a forensic accountant took the stand and showed that over 90% of the off-ledger funds had gone directly into the personal accounts of the board members and their relatives. The jury didn't deliberate long. All three were found guilty this time on federal charges. Harlow received a sentence of 22 years. Kent and Sheila each received 16. Their assets, including real estate, vehicles, and the balance of their retirement funds, were seized and placed in a restitution fund for victims. Franklin got his house back. So did two other residents who had been forced to sell under pressure. The state passed emergency legislation enabling temporary reversal of HOA-initiated foreclosures involving fraud. It wasn't perfect, and not everyone could be made whole, but it was something. The headlines ran for weeks. Local news, then regional. Eventually, national outlets picked it up. Maplewood Pines became a case study in HOA corruption and in how one neighborhood fought back and won. The state attorney general announced a sweeping audit of all HOA organizations with over 50 members. Over 24 other HOAs across the state were flagged for irregularities within 3 months. Some were shut down. Others were forced into complete structural overhauls. But back in Maplewood Pines, we were building something better. Our new board, made up of 7 residents, none of whom had served previously, was fully volunteer. No stipends. No perks. Every vote was conducted on an open forum. Financials were updated monthly and posted publicly in the new digital portal we built with a grant from the county. A retired judge from the neighborhood agreed to serve as a legal advisor, pro bono. And we rewrote the bylaws from scratch. Carlos, the veteran from the task force, helped us draft them. They limited the board's authority to fines under $100, required a 2/3 vote for any property-related enforcement, and prohibited all forms of forced entry, surveillance, or third-party inspections without written consent. We also added a recall clause that allowed any board member to be removed with a simple majority vote from residents. The first community-wide vote after the reforms passed wasn't about enforcement or violations. It was about converting the old clubhouse into a cooperative workspace and resource library. It passed unanimously. I started teaching a monthly workshop there called Know Your Rights, HOA Edition. We put laminated copies of tenant laws, property codes, and state audit guidelines in the reading nook. At first, only a handful of people came. Then more. Now we're full every month. Carlos even drops by when he's in town. The garage, the one they broke into all those months ago, is now a mini workshop. I fixed the door, installed a new reinforced frame, and added a biometric lock that logs every entry. Not because I'm afraid anymore, but because I want to remember what happens when you assume people won't notice. Every time I open it, I see the patch Carlos gave me stitched onto the inside panel, Watchdog Division. I kept it there as a reminder, not of who we fought against, but what we fought for. Late one evening, I stood in my driveway while the sun dipped low behind the trees. Kids were playing tag in the street. Someone down the block was grilling. A breeze shifted the air, bringing the smell of charcoal and cut grass. Marcus walked over, holding 2 iced teas. "You think it's over?" he asked, handing me one. I took it, sipped once, then nodded slowly. "It started," I said. "That's better." He smiled, not forced, not performative, just real. We stood there a while, not saying much, just letting the quiet settle in around us. Not the old silence, the one that came from fear or indifference. This was different. It was earned. And for the first time in a long time, Maplewood Pines didn't just feel like a neighborhood. It felt like home.